Hey guys, tonight we bidgin topic, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uvain, the dim stillness of a medieval monastery, where stone walls thickened against the cold and every footstep echoed. Like a chant, monks rose, not by sun or bell, but by the slow, flickering melt of wax. It was not clocks that first told them when to pray, it was candles. You might think the invention of alarm clocks was a sudden technological leap, but it wasn't. It was slow, uneventful, almost painfully dull. It began with monks needing to know when to wake for matins, the first of the 8 canonical hours prayers, spaced out evenly over the 24-hour day. The challenge was simple, yet maddening. How do you track time in a world without clocks, or even a consistent understanding of what an hour is? Centuries before gears tick behind glass, time was a sense, something you felt in your bones, not read off a dial. The sun was one guide, of course, but for monks who prayed long before dawn and long after sunset, that wasn't reliable. So they turned to fire. Fire, after all, consumed predictably, especially when caged in wax. A standard candle, when poured carefully with pure tallow or beeswax, burnt at roughly the same rate hour by hour. Of course, this assumed the room wasn't too drafty. The wick wasn't trimmed too long, and the wax hadn't been stored next to something damp. Still, this approximation was enough for monks who needed consistency more than accuracy. They began marking candles. Each mark was a unit of time. As the wax melted down to each notch, it signaled the passing of a fixed period, often 1 hour. Some candles were marked in thirds for shorter intervals. Others had pins inserted at precise heights. When the wax melted and the pin dropped, it clattered noisily onto a metal dish below rudimentary alarms, startling in their simplicity. This practice was called the candle clock, though it wasn't called that by the monks. To them, it was just another tool for obedience, one of the 3 sacred Benedictine vows alongside poverty and chastity. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written around the year 516, dictated strict times for prayer, and that meant someone had to know when the time had come. Imagine the stillness of the scriptorium at midnight. Ink freezing in the inkwell, fingers stiff with cold, solitary monk, watching the candle by his side, waiting for it to shrink past the next notch. When it did, he would rise and ring up. Small bell. Not the tower bell that would wake the whole community, but a quiet inner bell, a summons for the night office. The monks would then shuffle silently to the chapel, voices low, chanting psalms in darkness, guided only by faith and wax. It's worth noting that these weren't the grand cathedrals of Gothic fantasy. Most early medieval monasteries were cold, damp, and dark. Light was expensive. A single candle could cost more than a meal, so their timekeeping had to be both sacred and economical. They used every trick they could, sometimes combining candles with hourglasses filled with sand or water clocks, though those were rare outside larger centers, but candles remained the most democratic form of time. Eventually, this candle method was adapted beyond the monastery. Town criers, night watchmen, and even early scientists used them. Yet monks remained the most meticulous. They recorded how long a candle burnt under different weather conditions. They tested wick lengths. Some abbeys kept candle logs literal, books detailing how many hours each batch of wax could sustain. These weren't just for efficiency. They were acts of devotion. Time, after all, was sacred. In Cluny Abbey, one of the most powerful monasteries of medieval Europe, the candle system evolved into a complex hierarchy. The sacristan oversaw the candles for the entire abbey, over 400 of them during major feast days. They were sorted by purpose: vigil candles, altar candles, and time candles. Each had a role, and some had multiple. The sacristan was trained not only in liturgy, but in the chemistry of tallow. Some abbeys even developed layered candles, 3 colors of wax stacked vertically so time could be tracked visually. A white, section meant matins was near. Red indicated lauds. When it turned black and plan, primitive, but it worked. The life of a monk revolved around this rhythm. Time was not abstract. It was something you could smell burning. The scent of wax wasn't. Just ambience, it was instruction. You knew, instinctively, when the candle reached its final inch. You knew, even in sleep, when to rise. And yet time remained unstable, because of course candles were never perfect. A gust of wind, a different wax blend, a wick trimmed, a bit too low. All of it threw off the calculations. In the north, where winters were long and candles burnt faster in the cold, monks often had to guess. Some monasteries assigned a timekeeper monk a kind of human alarm. Clock whose job was simply to sit beside the candle and watch. This task, rotated weekly, it was not popular. Sitting in silence for 6 hours, staring at a candle, was a test of mental endurance. Many fell asleep. Others claimed to hallucinate. There are scattered records of monks confessing visions of saints or devils during candle duty, but the abbots knew the truth. Timekeeping was deeply boring, and that was the point. Boredom itself was a spiritual test. In fact, monastic boredom, what the early Christians called acedia, was seen as one of the most dangerous temptations. It wasn't sloth, it was a kind of spiritual restlessness, an agitation that made monks leave their posts or ignore the call to prayer. Candle watching, ironically, became both a cause and a cure. Watching time pass slowly reminded monks of eternity, of obedience, of the patience of God. But still, they tried to make the system better. In some places, bells were connected to falling weights triggered by the candle. It was the beginning of mechanical clocks, simple levers, a dropped pin, a bell. The transition from wax to gears had begun, but no one noticed it yet. The candle remained the master. Even outside monasteries, candles began to regulate more lives. Craftsmen used them to time labor. Early schools used them for lessons. Night watchmen, those unsung guardians of medieval towns, lit their patrol. Candles and judged the hours by how much wax remained. It's easy to overlook just how foundational candles were. Today, we think of them as decoration, but in those centuries, they were the very measure of life itself. Monk's day was not divided by sunlight or shadow, but by flame. The flicker of a wick was a metronome of devotion. And yet there were still problems left unsolved. For example, what happened when multiple candles gave conflicting times? Or when the candlekeeper himself fell asleep and the entire monastery missed matins, who in the end decided what time it was when time was made of wax? That question, who keeps the keepers, would slowly unravel the simplicity of the candle system. In the next section, we'll follow how this rudimentary method sparked something unexpected, a race to make time mechanical. In the candlelit cloisters of medieval Europe, time was still soft, pliable, something that dripped rather than ticked. But as monasteries grew in size and influence, and as their routines became more demanding and regulated, the limits of the wax-based system began to show. Candles were silent, passive servants of time. They did not ring, they did not correct themselves, and they most certainly did not protest when someone forgot to light them. The question remained, what if time could ring on its own? The answer came gradually, and not from monks alone. While monasteries incubated the culture of precise timekeeping, it was the rising tide of cathedral schools, early universities, and ambitious artisans who began to think in terms of mechanisms. Still, it would take centuries, starting with something so subtle and quiet that few noticed at first: the desire for automation. It is here that we meet the alarm candle, an ingenious bridge between wax and machinery. The design was simple, though not crude. At specific points on the candle, small metal balls or pins were embedded horizontally into the wax. These would eventually fall onto a metal tray or bell plate once the wax melted enough. The resulting pink white in a modern sense was unmistakable. In a stone monastery at 2:30 a.m. But monks wanted more. Some monasteries experimented with compound systems, a burning candle connected by string to a small hanging weight. As the wax melted, the string would release, allowing the weight to fall, and strike a gong. These gongs, though not musical, were large enough to wake entire dormitories. The challenge? Precision. A draft could delay the burn. A cold night could harden the wax. A knot in the string could keep the weight from falling. Time, it seemed, still obeyed the elements. This frustration gave rise to a quiet revolution, one that still spoke in the language of obedience. If candles were imperfect, perhaps it was time to move beyond them. But to do that required something alien to most monks: gears. The first mechanical clocks didn't look like clocks at all. They were large, wooden assemblies of toothed wheels and descending weights, more like a siege engine than a timepiece. They had no face, no hands, and no numbers. They simply rang a bell at regular intervals, much like the alarm candle, but without fire. The idea was simple. Instead of letting wax burn away and trigger a sound, you let gravity pull a weight, slowly turning a gear, which in turn moved a lever which then hit a bell. These were the earliest tower clocks. And their birthplace was not necessarily the monastery, but the bell towers that loomed above towns and cities, many of which were still owned and operated by monks or cathedral clergy. A famous example appeared in the late 13th century in Salisbury, England. It's often cited as one of the oldest working mechanical clocks in Europe. It had no dial, just a bell that rang every hour. No one needed to see the time. They only needed to hear it. And yet the monks had a curious reaction to these new machines. Some resisted. They argued that only human will could reliably keep sacred time. That a machine, however precise, lacked the soul to know when it was time to pray. After all, what? If it rang at the wrong hour during Lent, or on a feast day with an altered schedule? Others worried that delegation to machinery would erode discipline. If a monk no longer needed to remain vigilant over the candle, would he drift into sleep? But others welcomed it. In the massive Benedictine Abbey of Saint Denis in France, records suggest that a weight-driven bell was installed around the 14th century. It was tended by a brother trained in mechanical maintenance, still under religious obedience, of course. These timekeepers began keeping logs, not just of wax and flame, but of gear ratios, friction coefficients, and pendulum swings. This shift in responsibility is worth noting. The role of the monk who once sat by the candle watching the flame evolved into that of a technician. His boredom changed shape while he listened for the bell. He wound weights daily, greased the teeth of gears with animal fat. Time was no longer something to observe, it had become something to maintain. It was not just a matter of tools, it was a matter of trust. Where candles had been visible, measurable, and sensory, the mechanical clock was abstract. It asked the monk to believe that time was passing, even if he couldn't see it. That gears were turning behind the wooden panels. That the weight, descending slowly by the hour, was accurate. This abstraction unnerved some, and still, there was no standard time. You see, each monastery still defined its hours according to the rule of Saint Benedict, but those hours changed with the seasons. In summer, the hour between lauds and prime might be 75 modern minutes. In winter, it could be 45. Time was still elastic, tied to the sun's position. Mechanical clocks didn't adjust for this. They kept steady time, not solar time. And so monasteries began a curious balancing act, using mechanical clocks too. Ring the bells, but still relying on the prior or sacristan to adjust the schedule according to the daylight. Some abbeys even changed the weights inside their clocks during the year to speed them up or slow them down.
Ow.
This was not precision. It was a compromise. In 1335, Milan unveiled what many believe was the first public clock to strike the hour. Not in a monastery, but in a secular building, the Palazzo della Ragione. It was loud, it was impersonal, and it marked the moment when time began to leave the hands of the church and enter those of the public. But monks still led in refinement. One of the most fascinating transitions occurred in the monastery of St. Albans in England. A monk named Richard of Wallingford, born in the 1290s, was both a devout abbot and a mathematical genius. He created a mechanical clock so complex that it modeled the solar system, calculated lunar phases, and struck the hours. His design, the Albion, was never fully completed in his lifetime. But the plans reveal a mind balancing the sacred and the scientific with astonishing grace. Richard's clock was powered not by candles, but by escapement, gears, and innovation. That allowed energy to be released at regular intervals, forming the heartbeat of modern clocks. This innovation would later fuel the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the global spread of standardized time. And it all began with a monk. But even as mechanical clocks improved, the candle never fully disappeared. In small, rural, monasteries far from the urban centers of Europe, candles remained the timekeepers of choice. Cheaper, easier to repair, and deeply familiar. In these quieter places, the past lingered. A monk might light a candle marked for 2 hours, set a bell beside it, and drift into contemplation. As had his predecessors for centuries, tension between old and new never truly resolved. In fact, even in cathedrals with grand mechanical clocks, candles were still used during night prayers. They were symbols as well as tools. A candle was both light and time, presence and passage. It reminded monks not only of the hour, but also of mortality. As the wax melted away, so too did life. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. By the 15th century, mechanical clocks had begun spreading across Europe. Town squares echoed with hourly chimes. But inside many monasteries, both systems coexisted. The bell would ring the hour, and the candle would burn alongside it, a flickering relic of the past. And so, the monks who had once stared silently at melting wax now listened for gears to chime. Their task had changed, but not their mission. Time, whether measured in flame or friction, remained sacred. Still, one mystery remained. How did the general population begin to accept this idea of fixed hours when their days had long been ruled by the sun and seasons? How did the average peasant or merchant begin to live by bells? The answer lies not in the abbey or cathedral, but in the town square. As the 15th century wore on, and Europe's towns swelled with trade, labor, and ambition, the sound of time began to drift from sacred stone cloisters into the cobbled streets. What had once been a private rhythm of monastic prayer slowly became a public signal, announcing the new order of time, the hour. Well, it wasn't that people hadn't marked time before. Of course they had. Farmers followed the sun, bakers relied on feel, and markets hummed along to the rhythm of daily need. But their time had been local, flexible, and based on natural cues. A rooster's crow, a shadow crossing the church wall, the smell of bread rising in the oven. These were human times, not measured times. Then the bell came. First in monasteries, then in churches, and finally, mounted on towers in the center of towns. Large, iron-bellied things, some so massive that they had to be hoisted by entire teams of workers, suspended in timber frames and rung by ropes as thick as an arm. They were not tuned like music bells. They were meant to cut through wind, through stone, through thought. People listened. At first, the bell rang out, canonical hours borrowed directly from the monasteries. Matins, lauds, prime terce, sext, none, vespers. These terms filtered into the daily speech of villagers and merchants, even if few could tell them. Apart, what mattered was the pattern. You heard the bell. You knew something had started. Markets opened with a bell. Curfews closed the town with a deeper tone. Watchmen changed posts. Mills opened their gates. Courts convened. Eventually work began at the bell and ended with it. Just as monks had organized their lives around prayers, so too did townsfolk begin to organize theirs around commerce and labor. The bell had left the cloister, but this was not a peaceful transition. Time, once fluid and communal, had begun to harden into something measurably, and with measurement came control. No longer could a merchant say, "I'll meet you after midday," and mean when the sun is high. Now, midday had a bell. The bell did not care for weather, for harvest, or for tired legs. It rang on the hour, every hour, with an indifference that was new and unsettling. This is where things became political. You see, the control of the bell end, therefore the clock, became a matter of authority. In many towns, it was the church that rang the bell, preserving their sacred role. But in others, especially in burgeoning free cities, town councils took over. They appointed timekeepers, sometimes called bell masters or horologers, whose job was to maintain the mechanical clocks and ensure they rang on schedule. These timekeepers were often skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, or early engineers. Their new job was deeply boring but immensely important. They climbed the bell tower daily, wound weights, checked gears, cleaned dust from iron teeth, and above all, they kept time. They also became figures of quiet resentment. After all, who gave them the right to decide the hour? In some cities, fights broke out over bell schedules. Workers complained that the morning bell came too early. Shopkeepers grumbled that the closing bell rang before customers had left. In a few towns, there were formal petitions, medieval time protests, calling for the bell to be delayed or tempered. In one French town, the bell was sabotaged 3 nights in a row by locals who believed it favored the guildmasters. Time was no longer neutral, yet the shift was irreversible. Bells rang through towns from Prague to Ghent, from York to Naples. Time, once the private domain of monks and their flickering candles, had become a civic institution. The monastery had invented the rhythm, but now it was being played by others. Still, the candle never disappeared completely. In homes, in rural churches, and in small monasteries, the candle retained its place. Travelers carried time candles with marks etched in their sides. Some even used portable candle boxes, wooden frames with sliding lids, and vents to control airflow and prolong burn time. Were crude but effective. In a world where watches didn't yet exist, a candle remained the pocket clock of choice. Meanwhile, clockmakers, many of whom had studied under monastic patronage, began to refine their machines. The escapement gear, first seen in cathedral clocks, became more precise. Eventually, someone added a pendulum, a breakthrough that would lead to the accurate wall clocks of the 17th century. But these advances were still centuries away. In the medieval world, bells ruled, and bells had personalities. In some towns, the hour bell had a name. Old Tom, Big Agnes, Fat Maria, which had a unique tone. People claimed they could tell the time by sound alone, even blindfolded. In London, the bell of St. Mary-le-Bow was said to define who was a true Cockney. You had to be born within earshot of it. The bells dictated rhythm, but they also carried memory. A funeral bell rang differently than a curfew. A wedding bell sang higher than a market chime. Over time, the bell became more than a clock. It became a voice. A voice not of God alone, but of the entire community. And still monks prayed. In some monasteries, even with mechanical clocks in place, a monk would still light a candle at the start of each hour. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. A ritual echo of older days. The candle, for all its imprecision, had once marked sacred time. It was a way of remembering that time had not always ticked. Sometimes, it dripped. The candle reminded monks and maybe all of us that time is not just a schedule. It is a presence, a warmth, silence broken only by breath and flame. Even today, in remote corners of the world, there are monastic orders who wake not to digital beeps or electric chimes, but to the slow melt of wax. It is not practical, but it is deliberate. Perhaps in a world driven by speed, that slowness is the point. Because timekeeping did not begin with efficiency. It began with devotion, with quiet observation, with a monk watching a candle melt, marking the passage not of seconds, but of a life lived hour by hour. And so, in the end, we return to that image, a monk in a cold cell, watching a candle flicker. He listens. He waits, not just for the next hour, but for the silence that follows. Because time, in its truest form, does not shout, it whispers. If you were to walk through the quiet alleys of a European university town in the 14th century, say, Paris or Bologna wouldn't be greeted by the lively bustle of modern campus life. There were no leafy quads, no scheduled classes posted on bulletin boards, and no professors in tweed. Instead, you'd hear the faint scratching of quills, the shuffle of sandals on stone, and the occasional roar of a scholar's voice echoing through cold candlelit halls. It wasn't just the daylight that mattered in these early universities. It was bedtime. And not for reasons of health or social life. No bedtime was political. In these young institutions, time was not merely academic, it was contested. Question of when students were permitted or forbidden to study, read, or even be awake became a subject of heated debate. Not because sleep was sacred, but because it stood at the crossroads of power, morality, and economic practicality. To understand why universities argued over bedtimes, you first have to understand who these universities were. They were not buildings, not in the way we imagine today. The word universitas originally referred to a gilda group, a body. In this case, a body of teachers and students. These guilds often had no fixed location. Classes could be held in rented rooms, borrowed churches, or even outdoors under awnings. What unified them wasn't space, it was rules. Rules about who could teach, who could study, what could be taught, and crucially when. And this is where the trouble began. Because students, especially those pursuing degrees in the trivium grammar, logic, rhetoric, and quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, had very different ideas about the value of nighttime than their masters. By day, many students worked. They served as scribes, assistants, or even servants to wealthier scholars or townsfolk. Some carried firewood. Others ran errands for monks or spent hours in the freezing scriptorium copying texts by hand. Their studies, therefore, had to be squeezed into odd corners of time, especially the hours after dark. But here lay the problem: light. Candles were expensive, oil lamps even more so. The poor scholar, often barely able to afford food, could not always afford to burn a candle for hours into the night. And even when they could, landlords who often rented rooms to students were not thrilled. Fire was a constant threat. 1. Candle left unattended could destroy an entire block of timber-framed homes. And students, it was argued, were not the most careful of occupants. Some landlords imposed curfews, no candle use after sunset, no reading in bed, no late-night discussions. It was less about discipline and more about insurance. Universities responded by issuing regulations. In the University of Paris, for instance, by the late 1200s, official statutes restricted when students could attend lectures or use candles in rented quarters. The statutes were wordy, filled with legalese and Latin clauses, but their meaning was simple. Students must go to bed on time, or at least stop working visibly. Not doing so could result in a fine or expulsion. The concern wasn't only about safety. There were moral anxieties at play. In medieval thought was dangerous. Theologically, it was associated with temptation, idleness, and sin. 2. Much solitude in the dark was viewed with suspicion. Students studying Euclid at midnight might as well have been up to something far less scholarly. Discipline, after all, was central to education, and self-control began with bedtime. Students pushed back. At Oxford, records from the early 1300s describe student complaints about being forbidden from reading after Compline, the final prayer hour of the day, typically held just after sunset. Students argued that their workloads were impossible without nighttime reading. More controversially, some even began to gather in unofficial late-night study groups, known mockingly as the Candle Conspiracies. These groups met in back rooms or borrowed attics, each member bringing a portion of wax to keep the lamp going. They read aloud, took turns reciting texts, and quietly discussed ideas until the candle stubbed out. In some cases, these meetings were viewed as subversive, even heretical, because of their content, but because of their defiance of institutional order. And in that defiance, universities saw a threat not to safety, but to hierarchy. The medieval university was built on strict rank. Masters outranked bachelors, who outranked students, who in turn had to obey the statutes without question. Time. Discipline reinforced that order. So when students challenged bedtime, they weren't just asking to read longer, They were challenging the entire chain of command. Tensions flared. One well-documented incident occurred in the 1330s in Paris, where a group of students was caught holding unauthorized study sessions in the attic of a tavern near the Rue Saint-Jacques. The tavern owner was fined for harboring scholastic dissidents. The students were brought before the rector, who reprimanded them publicly and forbade the use of any candle not approved by a master. One student, it is said, responded that he would rather burn his eyes out than his intellect. He was expelled. The tension over bedtime also revealed something else: the class divide. Wealthier students, often sons of minor nobility or the merchant elite, could afford lamps, books, private tutors, and rooms of their own. They could study late without scrutiny. Poorer students, often relying on scholarships or monastic charity, had to share rooms, pool resources, and comply with candle rationing. Bedtime enforcement then was not equal. It became a proxy for control over the lower rungs of the academic ladder. Some universities attempted to level the field. In Bologna, records from the 1350s indicate that the university provided a communal reading hall where poor students could study after dark using shared candles under supervision. The hall was locked precisely at 9 p.m., no exceptions. Charles University experimented with issuing students candle permits, short slips, allowing 1 hour of post-compline study. These were rare and prized. And yet the arguments continued. Even within the faculty, opinions varied. Some masters, particularly those influenced by the scholastic tradition, argued that nighttime study led to clearer thought. They pointed to Aristotle, who reportedly did his best thinking in solitude. Others, more influenced by Augustinian theology, insisted that wisdom came through discipline, not indulgence, and that proper rest was essential to moral clarity. Eventually, bedtime debates became part of a broader conversation about the role of the university itself. Was it a place for inquiry or for obedience? Should it mold the soul or sharpen the intellect? Bedtime, boring, logistical, seemingly trivial, became the battleground for these larger ideas. Every rule about candle usage, every fine for midnight whispering, and every dispute over when a student must lie down was, at its core, a philosophical statement. And yet, amid all this, life went on. Students found ways to adapt. Some memorized entire texts during daylight hours, then recited them, silently in bed. Others carved shallow grooves into wooden desks where candles could be wedged safely to prevent tipping. One surviving desk from Heidelberg shows wax stains in careful lines as if marking out hours. The lamp became a symbol of quiet rebellion. To light a candle after curfew was to assert one's own pace of learning, one's own rhythm of thought. And in a way, it was the flickering continuation of what monks had done centuries earlier, measuring time not by bells alone, but by wax and will. Eventually, as universities grew more institutionalized and clocks became more common in urban centers, the curfews softened. Lamps became less controversial. Bedtimes are less enforced. But the echoes of that tension between order and inquiry, discipline and freedom remained. And so we're left with a question. In an age before electric light, before time was sliced neatly into hours and minutes, why did it matter so much when a student went to bed? What were they afraid might happen if someone kept reading? The rules were clear in parchment, at least. No candles after compline. No shared lamps in dormitories. No unsupervised group readings past sunset. Yet by the mid-14th century, the very act of following these bedtime rules had become rare. Not because students were lawless, but because the needs of scholarship had outpaced the institutions trying to contain them. And so, by candlelight and stubbornness, a quiet resistance flickered into being. It began not with confrontation, but with economics. Candles were expensive. Single beeswax candle could cost as much as a loaf of bread. Tallow, cheaper but smoky and foul-smelling, was what most students used, if they could afford even that. But as demand increased, so did price. In towns like Paris, Oxford, and Padua, a new breed of middlemen emerged: the luminar, candle dealer, who supplied universities, monasteries, and private students. These dealers operated at the edge of legitimacy. Some struck backroom deals with landlords to supply only their tenants. Others bribed clerks for bulk orders from university stores, then sold them at a markup. Students desperate for light paid, but many began to protest. In 1374, at the University of Paris, students petitioned the rector to fix the price of student-grade candles. The rector declined. Weeks later, a storage building was broken into. Wax supplies vanished. University blamed a group of art students, and the matter might have ended there had the students not decided to escalate. What followed was quietly called the Lantern Riot. It wasn't a riot in the modern sense. No bloodshed. Rather, one October evening, students across the Latin Quarter placed makeshift lanterns in their windows long after the curfew bell. Dozens of flickering lights glowed defiantly. They weren't reading. They weren't praying. They were simply awake. It was a gesture both absurd and profound. The authorities responded by fining the tavern owners who housed the students. The fines were symbolic, but the message was clear. We see you. Even still, the next night, the lanterns returned. Not in every window, but enough to make a point. The movement spread. At Oxford, a group of students formed an unofficial light cope, pooling money to purchase wax and distribute candles among the poorest members. It kept detailed ledgers, half-sticks, quarter-sticks, and stubs. Some entries read like charity logs, with annotations such as "For Walter of Exeter, who has no brother to sponsor him." The university eventually disbanded the group, citing unregulated communal behavior. The tension between obedience and need reached a peak in Bologna, where the university rector publicly burned a basket of confiscated candles in front of students during Lent. The act was meant as a show of moral discipline, fire consuming temptation. But to students who struggled to read at all, it felt more like punishment than piety. A new argument emerged. If students were mature enough to debate logic, theology, and law, were they not mature enough to determine when to sleep? But bedtime wasn't just a matter of discipline, it was tied to university financing itself. You see, many early universities operated under charters granted by local bishops or civic authorities, and they relied on predictable tuition, housing, fees, and fines to stay solvent. Bedtime regulations generated income. If a student was caught studying past curfew or using unapproved candles, they might be fined a few pennies. Enough to sting, but not enough to be unaffordable. These small fees accumulated and helped fund lecturers, scribes, and maintenance. One ledger from Prague University's archive shows that, in the year 1402, over 17% of all non-tuition income came from infractions related to nocturnal illumination. In short, bedtime was profitable. This financial incentive created perverse incentives. Some landlords would report their own students for late-night activity, then split the fine with officials. Others began charging light insurance fees up front, covering potential curfew violations. Students, meanwhile, started creating their own candle codes, knocks, signals, even special whistles to alert each other of surprise inspections. And yet, beneath the logistics and penalties, the original question remained: why were students fighting so hard for a few more hours of study? Because night was their only time. Daylight was noisy, chaotic, and filled with lectures, chores, and errands. Only at night could one focus. The silence, the solitude, the soft pool of candlelight created a space for thought unbound by the rigid format of classroom instruction. Some students composed poems, others translated Greek texts. Some, like the anonymous compiler of the Speculum Pauperis, Mirror of the Poor, wrote entire treatises in the margins of borrowed parchment, using candle stubs begged from friends. The candle became a symbol not only of learning, but also of identity. In some university towns, students began wearing small pins shaped, like flames or lanterns, a subtle signal of allegiance to the study-late philosophy. Masters noticed. A few tolerated it, others did not. One conservative theologian in Paris wrote bitterly that the modern student glows more with wax than wisdom. But the flame had already spread too far to be snuffed out. Still, it was not without cost. Candles, especially tallow ones, produced soot. Some students developed chronic coughs or eye strain. Few dormitories caught fire, including a tragic incident in Itzen Sembai Joshiti in Krakow, where 3 students perished when a shared attic study collapsed. The event prompted Krakow University to ban all unsupervised candle use, day or night, for nearly a decade. And yet the students returned. Quietly, stubbornly, they lit their lamps, because something more than scholarship was at stake. Bedtime was to reclaim autonomy in a system designed to mold, not just minds, but habits. It was, in some small way, a declaration of adulthood. By the early 15th century, attitudes began to shift. The invention of better oil lamps, cheaper wax alternatives, and early forms of centralized lighting in shared halls made late-night study less risky and less controversial. Some universities even began experimenting with structured night lectures. Held by candlelight and overseen by trusted masters, these were optional but popular. Students brought their own wax contributions and shared benches in silence as a single lecturer read from Augustine, Aristotle, or the Book of Hours. Still, the old curfews remained on the books. Even as late as the 1470s, some universities continued to fine students for reading past designated hours, but enforcement was inconsistent. Masters had begun to see that the fight against night study was, increasingly, a fight against the nature of learning itself. And so, bedtime became negotiable.
Oh.
The candle remained for a time as both tool and symbol.
Oh.
It was a reminder of resistance, of quiet ambition. Even centuries later, when scholars wrote about their university days, many recalled not the lectures, or the disputations, but the long nights by flickering light, sharing ideas in whispers, inventing futures that no schedule could contain. Still, one mystery endures. If the candle became the student's silent ally, what happened when it finally gave way to mechanical clocks and electric lights? Did something intangible, some vital part of the learning experience, fade with it? Or does every era of students find their own way to resist bedtime? By the turn of the 15th century, the candlelit rebellion had dulled to a flicker. The flames that once symbolized student defiance and intellectual independence were no longer smuggled or hidden, but permitted at least, partially by a university system beginning to modernize. Still, what lingered in those early hours of the night wasn't just the residue of melted wax or the scent of oil smoke. It was something deeper, more enduring. A culture of midnight thought. For all the statutes, curfews, and fines, the truth had proven inescapable. Students studied at night because the day was not enough, because knowledge demanded more than daylight allowed. Eventually, even the universities, rigid and reluctant, had to make room for this truth. It was not an easy process. Universities were slow to change, slower even than the church. While some institutions like Prague and Heidelberg experimented with limited after-hours access to reading rooms, others resisted well into the 16th century. The fear of fire never fully subsided, nor did the fear of idleness, gossip, or illicit behavior after dark. Some of these concerns were valid, but often they revealed an old belief rooted in centuries of monastic tradition, that time itself must be obedient.
Hours, maybe.
In monasteries, the hours were sacred. They were measured by bells, prayers, and routines unbroken by ambition. To alter the rhythm, especially to stay awake past Compline, was to challenge a divine order.
House.
The university, as an intellectual child of the monastery, inherited this rhythm. And yet, students, most of them lay people, brought with them different priorities. They were not there to pray, they were there to learn, and that made all the difference. One of the more striking examples of this shift comes from Louvain in present-day Belgium. By the 1450s, Louvain's university had grown rapidly, attracting students from across Northern Europe. Most were poor. They shared many rooms, books, and lamps. But unlike their predecessors, these students were no longer apologizing for studying. After dark, they were organizing it. A record from 1453 describes a rotating candle-sharing circle. Students formed groups of 5 or 6 and pooled their funds to purchase 3 candles per week. They kept strict rosters, who held the candle each night, how long it could be burnt, and who was responsible for trimming and rewicking it. These logs, preserved in marginalia and scribbled parchment, read like sacred texts of their own estimates to thrift. Structure and the hunger for knowledge. By now, shared dormitories had become less common in major universities. The increasing number of students, along with shifting civic attitudes, led to a rise in purpose-built colleges and hostels. These often came with their own statutes. Some were severe, closing reading rooms at dusk. Others were more lenient, providing wardens to supervise night study. Still, the students' need to think, write, and prepare after hours never went away. In fact, it only deepened. A new type of student was emerging, one who believed the life of the mind was not confined to hours set by church bells. These scholars were not monks. They were citizens, clerks, poets, translators, and scientists in embryo. And they were willing to trade sleep for knowledge. In Salamanca, Spain, letters from a student named Andres de Toro describe his nightly ritual in 1488. He wrote by the light of a single oil lamp, shared among 4 students. One held the lamp, one read aloud, one copied, and the 4th trimmed the wick when it smoked. They rotated roles every quarter hour. Andres wrote, "The smoke burns the eyes, but the words burn brighter. We will not sleep ignorant." Andres and his circle were not alone. All across Europe, the culture of learning was slowly uncoupling itself from the monastery clock. By the early 1500s, printed books were becoming more common, thanks to Gutenberg's press. This changed everything. Before print, students relied on reading aloud and memory. After printing, books could be owned, marked, and read silently, privately. Silent reading itself became a new frontier. It encouraged solitude. It deepened internal thought. Most importantly, it could be done at any hour. Students no longer needed to listen to a master or huddle around a single voice. With a book and a candle, a student could explore philosophy, medicine, lore, love poetry, alone. Still, the candle remained a gatekeeper. It determined how long a student could remain awake, how much text could be read, and how many ideas could be chased before darkness reclaimed the room. Some students learned to read rapidly, making the most of every minute of flame. Others learned to write in a tight, condensed script to conserve paper and ink. Time and light remained tightly bound. Mechanical clocks had improved since the crude, weight-driven devices of earlier centuries. Towns now rang hourly bells. University halls installed clocks to keep track of lectures and examinations. But personal timekeeping remained rudimentary. Only the wealthy owned private clocks. The rest lived by bells and candles still. As this slow shift unfolded, the nature of the bedtime debate changed. The universities no longer argued quite so openly about curfews or candle use. Instead, the question became more abstract. How much time should one devote to study? Was there a moral limit to intellectual labor? Could the soul be harmed by too much reading, as some theologians warned? Could knowledge consumed without reflection lead to pride or madness? In this period, a few unusual cases stirred public imagination. A student at Cologne was said to have studied so long and intensely that he forgot how to speak. Another in Bologna allegedly died with his face in a book, his candle still burning. These were likely exaggerations, but they reflected a new anxiety that learning, like fire, could consume. Still, students persisted. By the 16th century, with Reformation and humanism reshaping the intellectual climate of Europe, students no longer needed to justify their sleeplessness. Scholars like Erasmus, Melanchthon, and Montaigne praised the value of solitary night study. Candlelit rooms, once feared as hotbeds of idleness and temptation, were now celebrated as spaces of quiet discovery. And yet something had changed. The battles over bedtime had not disappeared. They had simply become invisible. The fight was no longer between student and rector, candle and curfew, but between the scholar and the clock itself. The pressure was internalized. Ambition, expectation, and competition now did what statutes once had. Students stayed awake not in defiance of authority, but in service to it. And today, in our world of digital screens and 24-hour lighting, bedtime is still political. Students still study into the night, still battle exhaustion, and still feel the weight of time pressing against ambition. The tools have changed, but the struggle remains. The medieval universities may have debated curfews and candles, but what they truly revealed was this: learning, when pursued deeply, disrupts comfort. It demands time, not always freely given. Sometimes it glows brightest, not in daylight, but in the smallest, quietest hours before dawn. So the next time you stay up late, reading or writing, eyes half closed, mind restless, remember, you're not the first. You're part of a lineage. It's a long, flickering line of minds who dared to keep. Thinking after the bell had rung, picture a pond not large, not dramatic. Still water, silt at the bottom, perhaps a few ducks skimming its surface. It's the kind of place most people might pass without noticing. But in medieval Europe, this unremarkable pond could hold the key to wealth, survival, and long, bitter feuds that would stretch not for years but for generations. Welcome to the world of the medieval mill pond and the slow, muddy conflicts it inspired. Let us begin in a small English village in the 13th century, though it could just as easily be in France. The Low Countries are parts of Germany, a village. Like this was held together by necessities: grain to eat, water to drink, land to till, and labor to spare. But grain, as any peasant knew, was useless without a mill to grind it. A mill was useless without water. This is where the mill pond comes in. A mill pond was a human-made or modified body of water, often a widened section of a stream or river, sometimes entirely dug out by hand. Its purpose was to hold water and provide the steady flow necessary to turn a water wheel, which in turn powered a grinding mechanism that could process wheat, barley, or oats into flour or meal. It sounds simple. In practice, it was anything but. Because water meant power, the owner of the mill controlled one of the most critical parts of the medieval food chain. Nearly every peasant in the village had to bring their grain to the lords, usually paying a fee in kind, often 1/12 of their grain, as a milling toll. That toll was called the multure, and it was non-negotiable. It was also compulsory. The lord, be he a noble, a monastery, or a wealthy lay landowner, had the banal right of milling. This meant that no one within the domain was allowed to build a private hand mill or quern. Doing so was considered thefty, not just of service, but of income. And this is where things began to get muddy. Let's say a stream ran through your village. Your lord or his predecessor dammed part of it to form a pond and built a mill beside it. That dam diverted water from the natural stream to a controlled channel, the mill resed, that turned the wheel. Now imagine you were a peasant farmer with land downstream. Suddenly your field is soggy year-round. Your livestock can't graze. It's worse, your tiny footbridge collapses every spring because of the backed-up flow. You complain to the steward? Shrugs. You petition the lord. He ignores you. Eventually, you take the matter to the manorial court. And that's where the real battle begins, not with swords, but with parchments, stewards, testimonies, and hours of slow, deliberate argument over inches of water and centuries-old rights. These disputes over mill ponds were some of the most frequent legal cases in local courts. Were boring, yes, but they were foundational. In one surviving case from 1274 in Kent, England, a group of tenants sued the local abbey, claiming that its newly enlarged mill pond had flooded their grazing pastures. The abbey responded by producing a charter written in Latin, naturally stating that their right to build, maintain, and expand the mill had been granted by King Henry II nearly a century earlier. The tenants argued that the charter referred to the old mill, not the current one. A bailiff was dispatched to inspect the dam. He brought a rope, a stick, and a scribe. The case dragged on for 5 years. Meanwhile, the pond remained. Why such a fuss over a bit of water? Because mill ponds represented the intersection of ecology, technology, and medieval power. To manage one required skill. Too shallow, and the water wheel wouldn't turn. Too deep, and fields would flood. Too fast, and the millstones might overheat. It was not just a matter of building, it was a matter of balance. The person who tended the mill was known as the miller, and while he was often a tenant of the lord, he occupied a curious social position, both essential and resented. Millers were known for skimming, because peasants were forced to use the Lord's mill, and because measuring grain before and after grinding left room for ambiguity. Millers had ample opportunity to borrow a little extra. Over time, this reputation became proverbial. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales even features a miller who is described as a thief of corn. Yet not all millers were cheats. Many were simply men trying to keep complex machines running amid uneven water supply, muddy gears, and the constant threat of legal complaints. And then there was the maintenance. A mill pond needed constant attention. Silt built up at the bottom. Weeds clogged sluice gates. Fish died if oxygen levels dropped. The wooden mechanisms inside the mill had to be cleaned of damp moss, mold, or slime. Rats were always a problem. In winter, the pond might freeze, and the wheel would grind too. Halt quite literally. Despite this, the structure of the pond itself, its boundaries, was sacred. If someone tampered with it, even slightly, they could be fined or imprisoned.
Nice.
In one recorded case from Flanders in 1311, a tenant was caught trying to dig a tiny channel from the mill pond to irrigate his cabbage patch. The steward measured it, just under 2 feet wide. He was fined 3 shillings and publicly shamed in the village square. The reason? His action could have reduced water flow, impacting the efficiency of the mill, and thereby lowering the lord's income. Control of water was control of wealth, and this extended beyond one village. In areas where multiple estates bordered the same stream, ownership disputes became jurisdictional nightmares. Did the pond sit entirely on one estate? Did it draw water from land controlled by another lord? What happened when drought reduced the stream to a trickle who got to grind their grain first? In 14th century Bavaria, one mill pond fed 3 different manors. During a particularly dry summer, the lords of all 3 sent representatives to negotiate usage. Each arrived with survey maps, charters, and arguments. They debated for 3 weeks and left with a temporary agreement, rotating access every other day. It didn't hold. The next year, the topmost manor rebuilt the dam higher and was promptly sued. Mill ponds may have looked peaceful, but they were constantly in dispute. Even monasteries, often seen as neutral or benevolent landowners, were not immune. Many abbeys owned multiple mills, some built as early as the 10th century. These provided them with steady income, but also entangled them. In the same legal web, at Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, monks recorded detailed logs of pond depth, rainfall, and mill efficiency. When villagers complained of flooding, the abbey steward produced pages of measurements proving the pond had not risen more than 6 inches above the last summer's level. They even began using stone markers, primitive hydrological gauges, to avoid disputes. Sometimes nature intervened. Mill ponds depended on seasonal rains. During droughts, water was rationed. During floods, dams collapsed. In 1322, storm destroyed the Mill Pond Dam at a Benedictine priory in Devon. The flood washed away the sluice gate, 3 sheep, and a quarter of the village's grain. The priory rebuilt it, but this time with stronger stone. That caused disputes, as the new dam raised the water level further than before. Even death couldn't end these battles. Charters often outlived their writers. One case, a pond built in the 1100s, remained under dispute into the early 1500s. 5 generations of millers, 3 lords, countless pages of witness testimony. The dispute was never fully settled. It simply faded as the mill fell into disuse. And yet, despite all this, the pond endured. Because even the most boring battle has its purpose. The fights over mill ponds were not wars of passion, nor revolts of desperation. They were slow, tedious, legalistic skirmishes over the everyday. But in them we see the foundations of something surprisingly modern: property rights, environmental management, public access, and infrastructure. Still, one question lingered in every village with a mill pond. When the water ran low and the pond dried to a puddle, who had the right to the last trickle? The modern eye, a shrinking pond might simply look like a patch of muddy earth. In the medieval mind, even the mud had meaning, especially if that mud once turned a water wheel. In the late 14th century, Europe began to experience fluctuations in climate. what some historians now call the Little Ice Age. Summers shortened, winters deepened, and rains grew less predictable. For rural communities that relied on mill ponds to process grain and maintain village rhythms, this brought more than inconvenience. It brought disputes slow, persistent, paper-heavy disputes over what remained when the water did not. And so the pond, already the site of delicate political balance, became something else entirely, a battleground over ownership of absence. Let's take a typical case documented in 1383 in the royal court rolls of Lincolnshire. A mill pond had fed the manorial mill for generations. Built originally by the estate of Lord de Roxby in the early 1200s, it had been maintained by tenants in exchange for milling rights, common arrangement. But that summer, after a dry spring and a poor winter snowmelt, the stream that fed the pond slowed to a trickle. By July, the water wheel no longer turned. By August, ducks waddled across the cracked basin. And then the villagers came forward. Not to mourn the loss of grain processing, but to claim the exposed land. Was told by my grandfather, said a tenant in testimony, that before the pond there were 2 garden plots. If the water be gone, the land returns, the Lord objected. His steward cited the continuous use of the pond for over 160 years. What was once altered for utility becomes permanent by law, he argued. The water, even in absence, belongs to the structure. The villagers disagreed. They planted leaks, so the case went to court. This was not unusual. In dry years, dozens of similar claims appeared in court rolls across England and the continent. The argument was always the same: if water no longer flowed, was the land beneath it now common? Or did it remain tied to the original water, right? Like a ghost of the pond itself? The law, as ever in medieval times, was muddy. There were no standardized rules for water rights. Each manor, each region, and each kingdom had its own overlapping set of customs, precedents, and unwritten expectations. Roman law, still influential in parts of Europe, suggested that running water could not be owned but controlled. Canon law, on the other hand, emphasized stewardship, the responsibility to manage natural resources wisely for the benefit of all. But what did stewardship mean when the water was gone? Some landlords attempted to codify their control. In documents known as customals, they recorded precise measurements of mill pond boundaries during dry years. One customal from the Cotswolds declared, "The land where the mill pond was shall be neither trod nor plowed by tenant foot, though the waters recede, for the pond remains by right." In other words, absence did not mean surrender. Still, tenants pushed back, particularly in towns where land was scarce and the exposed pond bottom promised a brief window of planting. Some moved quickly sowing barley or beans before officials even noticed the pond had dried. A few used the pond as a shortcut for their carts, claiming right-of-way once blocked by water. One village in Normandy reportedly held a May Day fair on the cracked bed of their lord's empty mill pond. It was seen as symbolic a celebration of access reclaimed, if only temporarily. In response, lords improvised. Some agreed to short-term licenses, allowing tenants to plant on dry pond beds, so long as they acknowledged that the land would return to pond status when the rains returned. Others hired surveyors to hammer wooden stakes into the pond perimeter, marking boundaries not of water, but of memory. Still others, particularly monasteries, took a more theological stance. They claimed that the dry pond was not a loss, but a test. Monks at an abbey near Worcester wrote, "As God withholds rain, so must we withhold impatience. The pond shall fill again." And in the meantime, they refused to permit any use of the exposed land. But the theological patience of the monks was not always shared by their tenants. In some regions, particularly the wetter valleys of the Rhine and the Low Countries, disputes over seasonal ponds led to actual skirmishes, small, localized fights. Not between armies, but between farmers with shovels and stewards with scrolls. One such conflict in 1411 resulted in several broken ribs, a trampled barley patch, and a hastily rewritten lease. At the heart of all this was a peculiar truth. Medieval people had to live in intimate dialogue with water. They lacked dams as we know them, lacked pumps, and lacked long-term irrigation systems. Water was both friend and enemy bringing life, and, when controlled, offering economic leverage. But water was never truly predictable. When it vanished, it revealed uncomfortable gaps in the legal and social structures built upon it. Mill ponds especially illustrated this fragility. They were artificial, but had taken on the weight of permanence. Generations had grown up seeing them, hearing their splash, feeding ducks, and catching frogs. And when they disappeared, Evan, for a season, it unsettled more than just the food supply. It unsettled the order of things. It's a sense of uncertainty. Found its way into the smallest corners of village life in East Anglia. One village appointed a pond watcher, a man paid to report weekly on the state of the mill pond during drought. He recorded whether the water wheel turned, how deep the pond was, whether fish were visible. His logs, mostly uneventful, are one of the few continuous records we have of seasonal change at the micro level in the 1400s. In other places, villagers made folk calendars based on the behavior of mill ponds. If frogs sang before Whitsun, the rains would return. If dragonflies skimmed near the dam, it was safe to plant. If the water dropped by Candlemas, expect a hungry Lent. These weren't superstitions. They were observations, a way of reading the world when books could not help, because there were no textbooks on mill pond law, no diagrams explaining how much water a sluice gate should release. Just local memory, cautious tradition, and a great deal of argument. Sometimes even the lords grew weary of the paperwork. One 15th century steward, writing in a moment of frustration, penned in his margin, "Let them plant leeks. The water shall have them in time," which it did. For often the rains did return. The pond refilled, the wheel turned, and the complaints stopped until the next dry season. And so the cycle continued. Not a dramatic feud, not a noble war, but a slow, grinding, deeply human negotiation between weather, need, and memory. Still, the question never truly went away. If land is covered by water for centuries and the water disappears, does the memory of water still own the earth? By the early 1500s, the mill ponds of Europe had become more than functional fixtures. They had become legal landmarks, cultural artifacts, and echoes of a particular way of understanding land, labor, and time. They were also increasingly vanishing. The slow change began with the growing market economy. Towns were expanding. Rivers, once treated as local utilities, were now part of regional trade networks. Larger mills, built near rivers with stronger, steadier currents, began to replace the small, isolated, pond-driven ones. Grain merchants preferred efficiency. Urban bakers demanded consistency. The sluggish, seasonal mill, pond once the pride of the manor, could no longer keep pace. But it didn't go quietly. Across the countryside, legal records in the 16th and 17th centuries show a rise in disputes, not over who could use a pond, but who could close one. The logic seems backward. Why would anyone care if a mill pond disappeared? 'Cause, in the eyes of tradition, a mill pond was not just water. It was proof of status. In one memorable case in 1528 near Dijon, a retiring noble family tried to convert their dried-up pond into pasture land. The neighboring tenants objected, not because they needed the water, but because the pond had once defined their village. It had marked the edge of their common grazing area. Children had grown up calling it the still eye. Its absence felt like a rupture in the social fabric. More practically, others feared that if the pond vanished, so might their recorded rights to use it. The court ruled in favor of the Lord. The pond became a sheep meadow, but the villagers kept calling it the dry pond for generations, marking a place not by what it was, but by what it had once held. This memory mattered, more than we might expect. The logic of medieval and early modern land tenure relied heavily on precedent. If you could prove that your grandfather fished in a pond or that your great-uncle carted grain across a footbridge, spanning it, that might carry legal weight in determining your rights today. So even when the water was gone, the pond had to be remembered, its borders honored, its habits spoken aloud. In this way, dried mill ponds became what we might call ghost landscapes. People knew where they were. They remembered when they froze, when they flooded, when they overflowed onto the cobblestones of the lower lane. And when developers or more often, ambitious lords tried to erase them entirely, they often met with stubborn resistance. One of the more revealing examples comes from 1612. In southern Wales, a new mill had been constructed on a larger stream a few miles upriver. It was faster, more modern, and capable of processing twice the grain in half the time. The old mill pond, now mostly dry, was declared obsolete by the estate's new steward. He wanted to drain the remaining marsh, level the land, and use it for timber cultivation. But the villagers objected. Fiercely they brought forward testimonies from elders, some in their 80s, who remembered swimming in the pond during childhood, breaking ice with sticks in winter, and helping to clear weed-choked sluices. One even sang a local song about the pond's frogs. These weren't legal arguments in the formal sense, but they were cultural ones. In the end, a compromise was reached. The land could be used. But a small memorial marker, a carved post with the shape of a water wheel, was erected in its place. The ghost of the pond remained. Other dried ponds found different fates. Some became orchards. Others were repurposed as fish farms or ice ponds for preserving food in warmer months. A few became sites of superstition, places where people believed old millers haunted the land, endlessly turning phantom wheels beneath the soil. But even the functioning ponds, by the 17th and 18th centuries, had changed in meaning. They were no longer unquestioned features of manorial life. They were business ventures. Leasing agreements became longer and more detailed. Millers were held to higher standards of efficiency and accounting. Some were replaced by salaried employees. Water rights were charted with mathematical precision. Disputes once resolved by custom were now adjudicated by courts, increasingly influenced by written contracts. In short, the pond had been rationalized, but something was lost in that transition. The strange, slow drama of muddy rights and memory. The way communities had once negotiated space with water fluidly, literally, and legally, was gradually replaced by something colder and less human. You might think that by the 19th century, the story of the mill pond would be over, but you'd be wrong. Even then, farmers plowing fields would find bits of stone remnants of old sluices. Surveyors would uncover boundary disputes rooted in 500-year-old charters about ponds long gone. In some places, lawsuits were reopened because the mill pond clause in an ancient lease had never been formally annulled. There's a haunting little note in an 1843 property ledger from Yorkshire, Parcel 12, dry ground. Former mill pond, once disputed, now pasture. Boundary stones remain visible when grass is short. The local name persists, the drowned acre. It's hard to think of a more fitting epitaph for the mill pond than that, because it was never about the water alone. It was about everything that flowed with its rights: labor, memory, status, and survival. It was about the deep medieval belief that land and time were intertwined, and that even when the surface changed, the echoes of history remained embedded in the earth. The battles were slow. The paperwork was heavy. The stakes seemed small. Behind every muddy dispute over a puddle was a larger truth about how human beings live with their environment, not as masters, but as anxious collaborators. So the next time you walk past a field with an unusual dip, or see an oddly placed row of stones curving like a forgotten shoreline pause, you may be standing where a wheel once turned, where villagers once argued, where frogs once sang, where grain became bread, where a boring, beautiful battle over who owned the water shaped the course of ordinary lives, one puddle at a time. It began, as many tedious but transformative things do, with a shouting match in a crowded market. The year was somewhere around 1125. The place, a port town along the northern Adriatic coast. Perhaps Pisa or Ravenna. The specific names have been lost to history, blurred by time, faded on the parchment, but the problem they faced has echoed. Through the centuries, someone paid for something. Someone else insisted they hadn't. In an age before carbon copies, electronic transfers, or even consistent surnames, disputes over payment were not just common, they were constant. For the early medieval merchant, it was the most exhausting part of the job. You might imagine that the origins of receipts, the simple paper trail we take for granted today, were invented by scribes in ivory towers, surrounded by ledgers and philosophical notions of accountability. But no, they were invented because a fishmonger couldn't remember if a customer paid him for 2 eels, and the customer was very, very loud. To understand how this small innovation unfolded, you need to picture the texture of early medieval commerce. Markets were vibrant but chaotic. There were no barcodes, no cash registers, and no calculators. Transactions happened fast, over barrels, across counters, beside open wagons often in 3 or 4 languages. Byzantine coins mingled with Florentine florins and Islamic dirhams. Value was fluid. Weights and measures, rough at best, trust fragile, fraying and fiercely defended. Was the glue that held it all together? Merchants, particularly those dealing in high volume or perishable goods, had a serious problem. They needed to keep track of who paid, who still owed, and which promises were reliable. Most relied on oral contracts. Some used witnesses. A few used tally sticks, simple wooden rods split lengthwise, each half marked identically with notches. These tally sticks were clever. One half stayed with the buyer, the other with the seller. Either could alter the notches without ruining the stick's symmetry. But tally sticks worked best for long-term debt, not everyday fish sales, linen, orders, or bulk grain purchases. So merchants scribbled. At first, the scribbling was crude, some scratched marks onto scraps of hide, broken pottery, or even bits of wood. Others used chalk on slate. But all of it was informal and lacked standardization, which meant that when disputes arose, as they inevitably did, there was no universally accepted way to prove payment. It was into this mess that a particular merchant, his name possibly Benedetto, or perhaps Duran, depending on which version you trust, decided he'd had enough. He sold textiles, bolts of wool and linen imported from the Low Countries, dyed in deep indigo or madder red. His customers ranged from nobility to innkeepers to laundresses, and they all had something in common. They expected to haggle, delay payment, and forget what they owed. One day again. The details Vera Benedetto was confronted by a furious noblewoman, insisting that she had paid for 12 yards of linen. He insisted she hadn't. She brought her steward as a witness. He produced his own apprentice. The argument went on for hours. Neither side backed down. So, he picked up a bit of parchment, wrote the date, the amount, and a brief note received from Lady V, the sum of 14 soldi for 12 yards of woolen cloth sea-dyed. He tore the bottom edge with a jagged line, handed her the upper piece, and kept the other. Later, if needed, they could be matched like tally sticks, but with words. It worked. This simple gesture, a note, a tear, a name quieted the storm. And so it began. Word spread among the merchant class. Not all adopted it at once. Parchment was expensive, ink smudged. Many still trusted muscle and reputation more than ink and scribe. But those who dealt with diverse clients and cross-border, trade began to see the appeal. Receipts were born not from visionaries, but from exhaustion. Over the next few decades, variations appeared across Europe. In Venice, fishmongers used wax tablets. In Bruges, cloth merchants used folded slips. With hand-pressed seals, in Constantinople, receipts became common among Jewish and Armenian traders dealing with both Christian and Muslim customers, for whom written proof was vital in courts with differing laws. Interestingly, early receipts were rarely just financial. They included details about time, weather, location, the weight of goods, anything, to establish context. Some read like tiny journal entries. Market day, second Thursday before Pentecost. Rain at dawn. Sold 3 salted cod to Pietro the baker. Payment of 2 denarii, plus 1 turnip in barter. Others bore tiny ink drawings, a sheep, a loom, a pair of boots used as visual shorthand for the illiterate. But still, the shouting didn't stop entirely, because the question remained. What made a receipt official? This was not a small issue. As receipts became more common, so did forgeries. Some merchants began stamping them with unique marks. Others used watermarks or peculiar folds. A few stitches of thread were sewn into the parchment to make alteration difficult. By the early 13th century, guilds began stepping in. In Florence, the Cloth Merchants Guild issued a set of formal receipt rules. All receipts must include the seller's and buyer's names. All must bear the date written according to the liturgical calendar. All must be copied in the guild's ledger within 1 week. Disputes would only be recognized if both receipt halves could be produced. It was a system that assumed trust, but checked it. It had transformed the way markets operated. The first time, buyers began demanding receipts not because they feared cheating, but because they recognized their own forgetfulness. Merchants, likewise, began keeping personal ledgers. Count books, once rare and informal, became tools of the trade. A few, like the Libro di Conti of Giovanni Ferralfi in 1299, survive today. Pages filled with looping Latin script amounts, paid notes scribbled in the margin, still owes 3 sous, claims husband is ill. Receipts also allowed for longer-range commerce. Merchants in Barcelona could now send goods to Genoa or Marseille and trust that the returning messenger would carry proof of transaction. Caravans crossing the Alps carried bundled packets of receipts in wax-sealed pouches, just in case a toll collector or rival claimant appeared with accusations. And yes, shouting still happened. But now, when tempers flared, both parties could slap down scraps of paper and shout over ink rather than memory. Oddly enough, this didn't erase oral tradition. In fact, receipts and spoken contracts coexisted. For centuries, many transactions were still sealed with handshakes and witnesses, but the receipt offered something that medieval commerce had never truly had before, a shared external memory. Still, the question lingered in many corners of the marketplace. What happens when the ink fades, the parchment tears, or the seal is stolen? Or worse, what if both parties have a receipt? They say different things. It is one thing to invent receipts. It is another thing entirely to convince people that they're telling the truth. By the mid-13th century, markets across Europe were humming with scribbled, proof-folded scraps of parchment, inked wooden slats, and wax tablets smeared and rewritten dozens of times. Merchants were writing more than ever before. The cramped backrooms of inns and counting houses, the paper trail was growing longer, thicker, and harder to manage. And it was beginning to talk back. That is, it began contradicting itself. Let's say a seller and buyer both present a receipt. One says the payment was partial, the other says it was full. One is dated the feast of St. Agatha, the other the day after. Both look authentic. Both bear matching seals. Both reference the same batch of dyed linen or salted cod. Both parties insist theirs is the original, whose parchment speaks the truth. This was not a rare occurrence, it was inevitable. Ink smudged. Names were spelt inconsistently. Dates were confused, especially since some towns followed the Julian calendar and others counted by feast days or agricultural events 2 weeks after shearing could vary wildly. Add to this that many transactions were conducted between semi-literate parties, and you get a landscape ripe for accidental or intentional duplication. The receipt, once invented 2 quiet arguments, had now become part of them. So how did medieval merchants respond? They adapted, slowly, reluctantly, but adapt they did. The first response was social. Merchants began to prioritize reputation as a kind of informal credit score. Certain sellers became known for keeping clean books, meaning their receipts rarely conflicted with others. These merchants, often older, or attached to powerful guilds, were trusted not because their documents were infallible, but because their characters were seen as cautious, consistent, and boring. And boring, in business, meant reliable. But reputation had its limits. So guilds and civic authorities introduced verification procedures. In Bologna, by the 1260s, the merchant guilds required that every receipt over a certain amount be registered in a communal book kept at the guild hall. Each entry was witnessed by a guild scribe and stamped with the city's wax seal. Disputes were settled not by comparing individual receipts, but by consulting the book. The book, of course, could be wrong too. But it introduced a crucial idea: centralized record keeping as the arbiter of truth. For many historians, this marks a quiet turning point in economic history, not a moment of invention, but one of recognition. Merchants were beginning to realize that commerce wasn't just about moving goods, it was about moving information accurately across time. Meanwhile, receipt design evolved. Merchants in northern Italy began using counterfoils, small stub, records left in a bound ledger, mirroring the contents of the receipts they handed out. Others turned to carbon copying's medieval ancestor, system of pressing heavily inked letters through thin parchment onto another sheet underneath. It wasn't elegant, but it worked well enough for daily use. Seals grew more sophisticated. Ink was sometimes tinted with unique combinations of soot, wine, or berry juice to prevent duplication. And handwriting, previously casual, became part of the authentication process. It was said of one Genoese trader, "You know his hand by the way he crushes the tail of the G like an eel's twist." Still, problems persisted. Receipts were lost. They were eaten by mice, soaked in rain, and smudged in candle smoke. And when they couldn't be found, or worse, when they were found in conflicting form, courts had to step in. This brings us to the rise of commercial courts. These were special tribunals, distinct from royal or ecclesiastical courts, designed to handle merchant disputes quickly and practically. They became especially important in bustling port cities like Venice, Marseille, and Bruges, places where merchants from across Europe collided with radically different customs and expectations. A typical case might involve a Flemish wool dealer and a Moorish spice trader arguing over a partial shipment and payment delay. Court would review receipts, call witnesses, and compare ledgers. Judges, often drawn from local merchant guilds, were less concerned with theological precision or royal law than with business practicality. If the receipts conflicted, the court considered who wrote it. Was it recorded anywhere else? Was the seal genuine? Did the merchant have a history of accuracy? Could witnesses confirm the transaction? And then came the crucial shift. By the 14th century, courts began expecting merchants not just to have receipts but to organize them. Sloppy records became a liability. In one case, from 1351 in Paris, a spice merchant's claim was dismissed because he stored all his receipts in a sack and could not find the relevant one within half an hour. The judge declared, "Commerce requires clarity. Your sack is not a ledger." That phrase would echo in merchant training for decades. With this pressure came innovation. Italian merchant schools began teaching bookkeeping as an art. A student's notebook from Florence in 1383 shows early exercises in ledger matching, comparing sample receipts with ledger entries to identify inconsistencies. Another included advice on ink mixing, paper folding, and how not to drop wax on your sleeve. Meanwhile, Jewish and Islamic merchants operating across Christian Europe brought new techniques from Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba methods for cross-referencing letters of credit with physical receipts and tallying complex multi-part deliveries. Their influence spread through Mediterranean trade networks, further refining receipt logic. Receipts were no longer just afterthoughts. They were strategy. So merchants began writing receipts with embedded conditions. For example, payment received if no defect is found in the cloth within 5 days. Others included poetic flourishes or symbolic phrases that only the buyer and seller would recognize, adding a layer of subtle authentication. It was not yet cryptography, but it was something close. And through it all, the shouting slowly began to fade. Not entirely. Markets were still loud. Disputes still erupted. But now, the volume was more often aimed at missing receipts than at each other. "Bring your slip" became a refrain. "If it isn't written, it wasn't bought," said one Venetian proverb. And yet, in this new order of ink and parchment, one doubt lingered in the minds of careful merchants. If truth is now written, and only written, what happens when the person who wrote it is no longer alive? By the dawn of the 15th century, the receipt had transformed from a messy scribble into something far more enduring, a stand-in for memory, a legal shield, and increasingly, a voice from beyond the grave. This was no longer just a matter of settling quarrels in the marketplace. Receipts now played a role in inheritance, wills, and legal proof of long-forgotten transactions. The written word, once second to testimony and tradition, was becoming the primary source of commercial truth. But truth, when disembodied from the person who spoke it, began to behave strangely. Take the case of a merchant named Paolo Ricci, a respected textile trader in Florence, who died suddenly in 1419 during an early outbreak of what might have been the plague. Within days, his family estate was overwhelmed with claims. Neighbors arrived with old notes and payment stubs. Distant clients sent envoys bearing wrinkled slips of parchment claiming payment had been made and made. Apprentices produced ledgers. A local nun showed up with a folded, wax-sealed packet, claiming that Ricci had promised to deliver cloth to her convent in due time. But Ricci wasn't there to confirm any of it, and so the receipts began to speak in his place. Of them contradicted each other. Some were forged amateurishly so, with incorrect spellings or mismatched seals, but some were real, painfully real. Receipts from years prior that Ricci himself had forgotten to collect on. Tiny debts, partial payments. Notes that read simply, "To be paid upon return of the ship," as the executor of Ricci's estate, a cousin named Marco, spent nearly 2 years sorting it all out. The local guild had to intervene, and in the process, something remarkable happened. Paolo Ricci's handwriting, his casual loops, his smudged dates, his shorthand for linen with red trim became more authoritative than any living voice. He had, quite unintentionally, created a paper version of himself that outlived his body. He wasn't alone. As merchants aged and passed on, their records became more than tools. They became legacies. Parents passed down not just shops and goods, but stacks of parchment tied in string, their edges worn soft by thumb and candle heat. These collections of receipts, sometimes spanning decades, served as both a family archive and a defense mechanism, because no one trusted memory alone anymore. And so, merchant families began formalizing the process. A few wealthy households even commissioned copyists to transcribe their business receipts into bound volumes, like ledgers of the dead. These volumes were indexed by name, product, and amount due. Some included margins with notes such as "died without paying, relinquished," or "family denies transaction. Watch for widow at Candlemas Market." It was, in essence, the birth of archival bookkeeping. This development didn't go unnoticed by the courts. By the mid-15th century, it became common practice for receipts to be submitted as posthumous evidence. Clerks and notaries began developing clearer formats, line spacing, formal salutations, and signature blocks. Seals became larger, sometimes embedded with fine strands of thread to prove they hadn't been lifted or reapplied. More importantly, cities and guilds began requiring certified receipt books. These were blank volumes issued by a guild or town, office, stamped and numbered, in which merchants were expected to enter copies of each receipt they issued. A receipt outside the book could still be used, but only if no contradictory copy existed inside the official record. This idea that documentation should be replicable and traceable was revolutionary. It laid the foundation for modern accounting. And yet, even as the system became more orderly, new problems emerged. What if a merchant died and someone found a forgotten receipt years later? Could a claim be reopened? The answer was a resounding, "It depends." In Venice, courts developed a limitation period, often 12 years. In London, some courts allowed claims to continue if it could be proven the receipt had been fraudulently concealed. In Bruges, the city council declared that receipts found in dusty drawers and unswept corners must be corroborated by at least one living witness or companion record in a certified book. Still many tried. In 1474, a farmer in the outskirts of Ghent attempted to sue a merchant's widow over a debt recorded in a crumbling slip of paper tucked into the spine of an old Bible. The ink was faded. The date is unreadable. The court asked the widow if she recognized the handwriting. She said, "Perhaps." But he wrote many things. The case was dismissed. And so, a strange tension settled in over the world of receipts. On one hand, they were trusted essential, even revered. On the other, they were increasingly vulnerable to scrutiny. It became clear that paper, though persuasive, was not infallible. A crooked scribe, a careless assistant, or a spilt cup of wine could render years of transactions incomprehensible. That fear prompted one final innovation: double authentication. Beginning in the late 1400s, Major trading houses, especially those involved in international commerce, required signatures on every receipt, the merchant, and a witness. The witness might be a clerk, a notary, or a second trader. Some cities even maintained a class of licensed receipt witnesses who, for a small fee, would stand by to affirm the transaction's validity. It was not foolproof, but it was yet another layer in a system evolving not toward perfection, but resilience. And that, perhaps, is the hidden genius of the receipt, not that it always told the truth, but that it recognized how fragile truth could be in a world of human memory and fading ink. Because at the core of this entire development, from shouted arguments over eels to notarized ledgers to sealed vaults of family books, was a single, boring, noble desire: to remember who paid what and when, to stop yelling, to keep things fair, to protect the little acts of trust that make life possible. You may not think about receipts when you tuck one into your wallet or when an email confirmation lands in your inbox. But somewhere deep in that practice is the echo of a merchant scribbling on parchment, sighing and muttering, "Let's just write it down," because even then, he knew that one day someone would come back and say, "I paid you. Don't you remember?" And the receipt would whisper back, "Yes, you did." In the grand tapestry of medieval Europe with its crusades, plagues, court intrigues, it's easy to overlook the quiet scratching of a quill in the corner of a stone chamber. But there, beneath the vaulted ceilings of a cold, damp chancery, a man named Osbert of Walsingham was making history in the least thrilling way possible. He was taking attendance, not casually, obsessively, relentlessly, monotonously. For decades, Osbert was not a monk, not a nobleman, not a warrior. Was what later generations might call a clerk, though in his time the term had more weight. He was educated, literate, entrusted with the task that kept institutions from crumbling, writing things down so others could not lie. He worked in the employ of the chapter of Ely Cathedral in eastern England around the late 13th century. Ely, a stately pile of stone and stained glass rising out of the surrounding fens, was more than a house of worship. It was a landowner, employer, political actor, and educational institution. It required a small army of clerks to keep it running, and Osbert, for reasons unclear, was assigned the driest of duties: recording who showed up. His primary tool was a massive vellum register bound in calfskin, reinforced with wooden boards, and chained to a stone lectern so it could not be removed. The pages were stiff and yellowed even in his day, lined with inked columns, each marked with the names of canons, choir boys, lay stewards, guest preachers, and various ecclesiastical support staff. Each day, Osbert arrived just after prime. The first service of the morning and began his rounds, checked choir stalls, classroom benches, and refectory tables. He peeked into dusty scriptoriums and drafty chapter houses. He did not merely tick boxes, he wrote short notes. Brother Thomas, absent, claimed illness, but later seen in orchard. Novus Edwin, present but silent, may be fasting. Canon Elfric, arrived late by 3 strophes of mourning hymn. Recorded weather conditions. He noted when someone arrived wet, muddy, or improperly tonsured. Sometimes he even drew little illustrations. A chicken pecking at sandals, a tiny cart tipped in mud. It would be charming if it weren't so. Relentless. Most clerks cycled through multiple duties: a few months recording food inventories, a season spent copying Latin texts, occasionally assisting in estate audits or letter writing. But Osbert stayed with attendance, year after year, page after page. Modern scholars believe this wasn't entirely by choice. Hints from surviving letters suggest that Osbert once aspired to become a scribe for the royal chanceria. More prestigious, though equally boring position, drafting official proclamations. But a misplaced letter, or a miscopied seal, may have landed him permanently in the administrative backwater of Eli's internal ledger keeping. Yet if Osbert was disappointed, he never said so. His handwriting remains as neat in the 15th year as it does in the first. The ink darkens, then lightens as supplies shift. But the tone of the entry stays constant, observant, dry, but quietly amused. Attendance, you see, was serious business in medieval ecclesiastical life. Daily routines were sacrosanct. Canon, who skipped too many prayers without permission, could have their pay docked. A novice absent from lessons might be delayed in his vows. Guest lecturers, if they failed to appear on scheduled days, could cause entire theological debates to collapse. The logic was simple. A community that did not track itself would drift apart. And so, Osbert's ledger became a kind of moral compass. By the 1290s, the bishop himself reportedly consulted Osbert's books before making personnel decisions. When a new choir director was being considered, he reviewed 5 years of Osbert's notes. One entry read, "Brother Henry present, but inattentive, mouth moved without sound." The bishop chose someone else. Osbert never commented on such outcomes. He merely recorded what he saw. But what he saw was changing. In 1295, Ely suffered a brief outbreak of sweating sickness. Several clerics died. Attendance dropped. The services grew quieter. And Osbert, ever diligent, noted, 5 stalls, empty this day. Bells still rung at the usual hour. By 1298, changes in church politics brought an influx of young scholars from Cambridge. Their habits were looser, their Latin more florid, and their attendance, inconsistent. Osbert's entries gained a slightly sharper edge. Scholar Jerome appeared with an unfastened gown and offered an explanation involving geese. Brother Reginald was present but appeared drowsy. He may have attended a tavern vigil. Still, he never editorialized, was never scolded. He recorded that was his calling. And then, in 1301, he did something strange. He added a column. Until then, the register had simply tracked presence and absence with occasional notes. But Osbert began assigning a small mark, a circle, square, or triangle next to each name. No key was offered, no explanation. The symbols changed irregularly. Some scholars believe they represented punctuality. Others think they reflected tone of voice, level of engagement, or perhaps even Osbert's personal impressions. For example, Canon Elias, present triangle Brother Martin, present circle scholar Petronius, absent square, crossed. Why did he do this? No one knows, but the practice continued for nearly a decade. At some point, others noticed. A young clerk named Aldwin, in a surviving margin note, wrote, "Osbert marks us as though God were reading over his shoulder," and perhaps that was exactly how Osbert saw it, because in a world where few could read and where few were still, had access to written records, the ledger was the closest thing to immortality most men would know. If he recorded someone's diligence or dereliction, it might be read not just by a bishop, but by posterity, or judgment itself. And so, he kept writing. The ink froze some winters. His fingers stiffened. At least once, he fell entries. Are shaky for several weeks, interrupted by another hand briefly stepping in with looser script and far less detail. But Osbert returned, and continued, till sometime around 1313. That's when the entries suddenly change. The names are still there, the time's still marked, but the voice, the steady, quirky, precise tone of Osbert has vanished. The new writer signs as Nicholas, his script is slanted, his notes are sparse. Osbert's final entry is short, present. Cold morning, choir sounded thin, and that's it. No death notice, no farewell. Just a disappearance. Nicholas never explains. Merely carries on without symbols, without comment. The ledger remains. It continues into the 1320s, then merges into another book, and finally disappears into the dusty corners of cathedral archives. But Osbert's part endures. Nearly 2 decades of daily documentation, meticulous, irreplaceable. Today. That attendance book sits in a climate-controlled vault in Cambridge, catalogued under a name no one remembers and a purpose few understand. But it holds something strange and wonderful, the echo of a man who watched his world unfold one morning, at a time who believed that showing up mattered and that even the dullest details were worth recording. Still, one question remains, silently tucked between the columns and scribbles. Why did he start marking the triangles? The silence Osbert left behind was not total. Something in the rhythm of the entries changed, not just in tone or handwriting, but in purpose. Nicholas, the clerk who took over after 1313, kept the columns neat and the times regular. But the flourishes, the little observational notes, the obscure symbols, those were gone. Attendance resumed as record, but no longer as reflection. And yet, what Osbert had done over nearly 20 years had already left its mark. Literally. Across hundreds of vellum pages, Osbert's coded marked circles, triangles, and squares spread beside names like medieval constellations. Most scholars who've examined the ledger agreed that the symbols weren't arbitrary. They appeared too methodical, too persistent. The question was, what did they mean? Modern historians with access to high-resolution scans and data analysis tools have spent years trying to decode them. One theory suggests Osbert was developing an early performance metric in an attempt to track not just presence but behavior. A circle may have meant on time and prepared. A triangle, present but inattentive. A square, absent or problematic. Over time, these marks appear to align with known disciplinary actions recorded elsewhere in the cathedral chapter. Roles. Canons who were demoted or reassigned often had frequent triangles in their final year. Choir boys promoted to lead chants often had a string of circles beside their names. Another theory is more psychological. Osbert, isolated in his duty, may have been using the symbols as a kind of emotional shorthand, a private system to express frustration or approval in a world that gave him no voice. In a letter fragment preserved in Eli's correspondence archives, another clerk wrote, "Brother Osbert watches all with the patience of a stone angel. But behind the calm, I sense his ink speaks louder than he dares." It's easy to romanticize such interpretations, but the reality may be simpler and sadder. Osbert's work, however mundane, was also lonely. He lived, as many clerks did, in a room near the cathedral's east cloister. His life was bound by the bell towers, the cold corridors, and the routines of others. His task required presence without participation. He watched, noted, and documented. Perhaps the symbols were his way of asserting personality in a world that treated him like furniture. But the true significance of his system didn't emerge until long after he was gone. By the 1330s, the concept of tracking behavior had quietly spread. Other cathedral schools, notably York Wells and St. Albans, began implementing new attendance forms. Some mirrored Osbert's structure, almost exactly 3 columns. Names, presence, and a small space for observation. A few even used marks similar to his. One surviving ledger from Lincoln Cathedral, dated 1342, contains triangles next to 5 different choristers. Whether this was conscious imitation or coincidence is impossible to say. What is certain is that clerical accountability was becoming standardized, and Osbert's obsessive approach had helped normalize it. Attendance was no longer just about being present. It was becoming about how one was present. Quietly, without fanfare, the idea of measurable conduct took root in church administration. Canons were assessed not just on sermon quality or musical skill, but on reliability. Over time, behavior reports became formalized. New columns appeared: punctuality, participation, reverence. The seeds Osbert planted with his mysterious symbols blossomed into bureaucratic norms. This shift had surprising consequences. For one, it altered promotion and punishment within religious institutions. In earlier centuries, advancement had largely depended on patronage, seniority, or scholarly reputation. But by the mid-14th century, internal records, including attendance, behavior began influencing decisions. Bishops and priors consulted. Ledgers when filling positions. A clean attendance sheet became a mark of character. In a way, Osbert helped invent the HR file. This development wasn't universally welcomed. Some clerics, especially those trained in older traditions, found the growing scrutiny invasive. One scathing letter from a disgruntled canon at Salisbury reads, "Shall I be judged by quill scratches? Am I no more than my hours logged and head bowed?" Others embraced it, especially the rising class of clerics from less aristocratic backgrounds. For them, punctuality and presence offered a path to recognition that lineage could not provide. In their eyes, Osbert's system democratized advancement. But the effect wasn't limited to religious life. By the early 15th century, attendance records had spread to guild schools, municipal councils, and even some merchant guilds. The idea that participation should be logged and reviewed was no longer confined to cloisters. It was quietly reshaping how organizations thought about trust and diligence. And still, Osbert remained a mystery. His name rarely appears outside the ledger. There are no portraits, no tomb inscription. Only one other documentan inventory of cathedral supplies bears his full signature: Osbert de Walsingham, servitor at scriptor minor, a minor clerk, a servant, a small name. Added in the background, his influence lingered. So much so that in 1451, long after his death, a clerk at Ely made a curious entry in the margin of a newer attendance book. "I have found a box of ancient sheets, marked with strange symbols." Some older brother tried to read souls with shapes. Strange mind, but neat hand. That box, now long disassembled, may have contained Osbert's working papers drafts, notes, or perhaps even the key to his symbolic code. But if so, that key is lost to time. What remains is the ledger itself, preserved in the cathedral archives, its pages brittle, its ink still legible. And while others came after, writing names and checking heads, none matched the quiet intensity of Osbert's record, because he didn't just take attendance. He turned it into a window's small square, and dusty, through which we glimpsed the rhythms of medieval life. Who showed up, whispered, who dozed, who left early, who always arrived just before the bell, and who over time stopped coming altogether. In the end, we're left not just with a list of names, but a question that Osbert never answered. Did he believe that watching people tracking them could shape them? Or was he simply bearing witness, one triangle at a time? If you've ever stood in a modern office, classroom, courtroom, or council meeting and watched someone check off a name, you've seen Osbert's legacy, even if no one else knows it. Because what he built in silence over decades was not just a ledger of who showed up and who didn't. It was something more durable, something invisible that still underpins how we trust, manage, and remember each other in organizations today. And it all began with someone quietly writing things down. Osbert's ledger, the chain-bound, calfskin-bound, scratch-marked monument to presence, did not disappear when he did. It survived him, and in doing so, it became a record of continuity. Long after its creator vanished from the corridors of Ely Cathedral, the book remained as the most reliable witness to daily life. It told, without judgment, how religious institutions functioned not just in ritual, but in routine. Because for medieval communities, especially those as hierarchically structured and rhythm-bound, as cathedral chapters or monastic colleges, routine was not an afterthought, it was theology in action. To be present at morning prayer, to appear at mealtime, and to attend weekly confession was to participate in a shared spiritual rhythm that mirrored the divine order. And so Osbert, in his way, was recording more than mere attendance. He was measuring harmony. We know this because the few pages following his tenure, written in the hand of Nicholas and his successors, grew sparser, less observational. Symbols vanished. And in time, the third column, where Osbert had once scribbled triangles or noted muddy feet, disappeared as well. By the early 1320s, the attendance ledger became mechanical. It ticked off names with a lifeless regularity. What had once been a living documenta, sensitive daily pulse of community behavior, had reverted to simple bureaucracy. But it couldn't stay there forever. Something about Osbert's habit of watching carefully had planted a deeper idea in the minds of those who followed. Though his exact symbols were never explained, his concept that presence is more than physical, that patterns in behavior reveal deeper truths, began to take hold elsewhere. Let's look briefly at Winchester College, one of England's oldest public schools. It's founded in 1382. Within 30 years, it had adopted a three-tier attendance system inspired by earlier ecclesiastical models. Students were marked not only for attendance, but also for timeliness and conduct during prayers. Absences were classified as excused, neglectful, or unaccounted. A copy of the school's first attendance register shows faint margins filled with check marks, spirals, and strange shapes, Not triangles, perhaps, but echoes of Osbert's system nonetheless. By the 15th century, the idea had even made its way into the royal courts. Under Henry VI's chancellery, scribes were required to document not only the appearance of advisors and clerks, but also whether they participated in discussions or remained silent. Present and withdrawn was a common phrase. Attended, but no contribution recorded, was another. This wasn't Osbert's language, but it was very much his logic. Presence is not just about the body, but the mind. Back at Ely Cathedral, Osbert's name faded, but his influence returned in subtle forms. In the late 1400s, a reform-minded prior named Thomas Becket, no relation to the saint, instituted a new form of internal oversight. Weekly behavioral summaries based on attendance, books. His surviving notes show that he consulted older ledgers, including Osbert's hand, was deeply impressed by the level of detail. He wrote in one margin, "There was a clerk in earlier days who saw what others missed. I find in his marks the mind of a careful watcher. He gave us a mirror. We must polish it again." That mirror, by then dusty and cracked, reflected a central tension of medieval institutional life. What do we do with people who are technically present but spiritually absent? How do we measure engagement? How do we document integrity? Osbert never answered those questions directly, but he hinted at them. Over and over again, his ledger asks the reader to notice the smallest acts of presence: the bowed head, the quiet cantor, and the absent but excused novice. He reminds us that accountability isn't always grand or obvious. Sometimes it's a square of ink next to a name, drawn in silence. And here lies the surprising truth. Osbert's obsession, his boring commitment to checking names, may have helped create a fundamental tool of civilization, the idea that being present matters, and that how we record presence shapes justice, order, and memory itself. When the Black Death came in waves across England, these ledgers provided some of the only demographic records that survived. When church disputes erupted over pay, land, or rolls, attendance records were often the first documents brought to court. When historians today try to reconstruct how a medieval community functioned, how many choir boys, how many teachers who sang on feast days, who vanished during outbreaks, they turn first to the ledgers. They turn, unknowingly, to Osbert. So what can we take from this? Maybe nothing grand. That's the spirit of this project, after all. But perhaps this: the quiet people who track the boring details are often the ones who leave behind the clearest traces. They don't storm castles or write manifestos. They don't start wars or paint ceilings, but they keep us honest. They give structure to our days. They notice when we're late. They remember when we stop showing up. Sometimes they leave behind triangles beside our names.